If I could have settled down, I said to Biddy, plucking up the short grass within reach, much as I had once upon a time pulled my feelings out of my hair and kicked them into the brewery wall. If I could have settled down and been but half as fond of the forge as I was when I was little, I know it would have been much better for me. You and I and Joe would have wanted nothing then, and Joe and I would perhaps have gone partners when I was out of my time. And I might even have grown up to keep company with you, and we might have sat on this very bank on a fine Sunday, quite different people. I should have been good enough for you, shouldn't I, Biddy? Biddy sighed as she looked at the ship sailing on and returned for answer. Yes, I am not over-particular. It scarcely sounded flattering, but I knew she meant well.
Ho-dee-oh-ho, 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 ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we are going to be talking about Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Now, are you a big fan of Dickens?
I haven't read that many of his works. I read Great Expectations and I read bits and pieces of some of the other novels, but there's others I'd really like to return to, like I'm impelled to look at The Tale of Two Cities sometime before too long. I'm interested in how he thinks about history, especially after having reread Great Expectations for today.
Oh, that's interesting. I had to read a few of Dickens' novels in high school and middle school, including Great Expectations, and they did not appeal to me much then. I seem to remember mostly pretending to have read Great Expectations at the time. And I've gone back to him every so often to see if maybe I will enjoy his work now. And generally speaking, I haven't. There's a really great essay by George Orwell that I've read many times about Charles Dickens. I'm a big fan of Orwell's essays in particular. And I would read this one as I was just reading Orwell, and then I'd say, oh, I really need to try Dickens again. And I would go back to Dickens, and I would not make it very far.
I would think Orwell's take on Dickens would be kind of critical, right? Because Orwell is sort of conscious of the social and political implications of the literature he writes about. I would have thought he'd find Dickens kind of disappointing.
Well, it's a super interesting essay in part because it sort of starts out like that, or rather, it starts out by looking at all the different groups who have claimed Dickens. Dickens is almost a Marxist, or he's almost a revolutionary social activist for the poor, or he's almost a Catholic, or he's almost a conservative, traditional England for the English kind of person. And Orwell's like, no, he's not any of these. And then he tries to figure out exactly what Dickens's politics are. And then at the end of the essay, there's a section where he's like, and politics are important. Art exists in a political sphere. But we should also talk about what people love about Dickens and what I love about Dickens and the things that Dickens is especially good at. It ends with this much more literary appreciation of what is great about Dickens, which Orwell says is partially because he's forced down your throat as a kid. And so he's super familiar to everybody. Even when he was writing, even back then, that was the case for how people read Dickens. Even people who hadn't read Dickens were familiar with these really larger than life characters that he'd created. And part of the culture was that people could do imitations of these famous characters. And everybody knew what you were doing, just like you might recognize something from Star Wars, even if you haven't seen the Star Wars film, because it's just part of the culture.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, when I was rereading Great Expectations for today, I was reminded of all of those allusions to Dickens' writing in Little Women. Remember when we were talking about how the March girls would sort of read aloud from the Pickwick Papers or would adopt character names from them, from Dickens' earliest work, when they would be doing their sort of newspaper that they would write in their home. So this whole idea of Dickens being this kind of imaginary landscape, this imaginative landscape that you might inhabit, this is a huge thing in the mid-late 19th century, right? So he was popular right through that whole period. So every generation kind of has its own Dickens.
But we still have Dickens as well. He's still around. We're still getting Muppet Christmas carols and things like that.
I love that movie.
It's very good.
So do you think Great Expectations is still read in the schools? I wonder how many people are familiar with the plot of it already.
I mean, I read it, and while I am old, I don't know if I'm that old. So there's a lot of plot in this novel, and there are some spoilers, I guess.
There are spoilers. So yeah, if you're really excited about the plot, watch the movie and then come back.
Yeah, exactly. So, Great Expectations is a novel. It's written in 3 parts or 3 volumes. Some editions keep the volumes in, some don't, whatever. The first of those parts is the setup. Our narrator is Philip Pirrip, who as a child couldn't pronounce his own name, and so he goes by Pip. And his father died just before his birth. His mother died giving birth to him, and so he's raised by his sole surviving sister and her husband, whose name is Joe Gargery. Joe is the blacksmith in the small marshy town they live in several miles outside of London, and Joe is the picture of sweetness. Mrs. Joe, on the other hand, is physically abusive. But, they get by. One Christmas Eve, young Pip is visiting his parents' gravestone when he runs into a recently escaped convict, and Pip agrees to get the terrifying man some food and a file so that he can remove his shackles. Despite Pip's assistance, the convict is quickly recaptured. Not long after, a curious woman from the rich part of town, named Miss Havisham, is looking for a young boy to entertain her by playing with her adopted daughter, Estella. Miss Havisham is another terrifying figure. Years ago, she was left at the altar, and now she spends her days in her dark mansion, wearing her bridal gown and letting her wedding cake continue to fester. Pip is paid to visit Miss Havisham regularly, and he develops a strong crush on Estella. However, Miss Havisham has raised Estella to break the hearts of men in order to avenge her own spoiled wedding day. Estella makes Pip feel ashamed to be so low class, and he dreams of being a gentleman in order to win her over. But that's impossible, right? Well, a few years later, and it turns out maybe not. Jaggers, Miss Havisham's lawyer, arrives to tell Pip that a mysterious benefactor has set him up handsomely, and he's no longer to be an apprentice blacksmith, but rather a gentleman of leisure. And this begins the second volume of the book. Pip is swept off to London to be kept lightly under Jaggers' watch. Jaggers, as it turns out, is a criminal lawyer, and Pip gets to encounter quite a lot of the justice and prison systems in London, but he's also getting some vague education in how to be a gentleman from his roommate, Herbert Pocket, a cousin of Miss Havisham's, about Pip's own age. Pip remains convinced that his income, his great expectations, are from Miss Havisham, and that she intends for him to marry his dear Estella. But, finally, the truth is revealed. His benefactor is in fact the convict, named Abel Magwitch, who was exiled to Australia and who made a vast fortune there, legally. Magwitch returns to London to see how Pip is faring as a gentleman, but if Magwitch is found in London, he will be executed for disobeying his exile, and his property will be confiscated by the crown, and thus no more expectations for Pip. The last third of the book is an adventure story, as they try to get Magwitch safely out of the country, but, alas, it doesn't quite pan out. Magwitch dies in jail awaiting execution, Pip loses all his money and expectations, and as a final blow, Estella gets married to a complete brute. And yet, somehow, in the last chapters, enough time passes to allow Pip a sufficiently happy ending after all, and perhaps a second chance with a more matured and softened Estella.
There's a lot of plot.
There's a lot of plot, and I left quite a lot out. But there's a lot that goes on in this novel. It is, in many ways, the opposite of Emma.
Yeah, it's true. And the chapters are, particularly the books, but the chapters also are very cliffhangery, you have a kind of sense of anticipation and sort of what's going to happen next at the end of many of these chapters.
And that's because it was originally published serially, right? It was in small chunks of about 2 chapters per installment.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes people talk about that kind of writing as, being paid by the word, very expository, very detailed, with a very capacious plot. And Great Expectations actually he published in a journal that he himself was the proprietor of. So he wasn't being paid by the word in the sense that it was his own kind of undertaking. But nonetheless, that style of writing persists, right? And so it's not just about the being paid by the word aspect. It's about a certain kind of writing that spoke to its audiences, right? And that gives you something kind of different from what we expect in a contemporary novel, I think.
Yeah, I didn't find this one to be excessively digressive, although it's perhaps true that Dickens was trained as a writer by being paid by the word, and so some of those habits may have stuck around even as his writing changed and matured over time. But it definitely had that sense of being so packed with plot because you needed something exciting to happen in each segment, and it needed to be something so exciting that it would draw readers back into the fold, right? They would purchase the next issue.
Yeah, it's neat that you say viewers, readers, like that, but that impulse is there because they are vivid. I mean, these characters are vivid. He gives you either character traits or details of dress or accoutrement in their rooms or their other domestic spaces that tell you something about the person. And it's just, you get almost like a mnemonic kind of function for these abundant number of characters. And also you get these little recognition scenes where Pip is like, whoa, I saw this person, when I was a kid, or whoa, I know where I saw this person. And you get enough of that detail of Pip's experience of recognizing to let you remember, oh yeah, like 15 chapters ago, that encounter. Like, for example, Herbert Pocket, his roommate, when he encounters him as a young man in London, after a couple of moments, he realizes, oh, this is the kid I brawled with back at Miss Havisham's house way back when. And when you're a reader, you're like, what? And then you're like, oh, yeah.
There is that. I can't imagine reading this over the course of months and months and maybe even a year to be expected to remember details like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, right. There was that weird fight scene that I read about 9 months ago. I mean, I guess that happens if people are watching TV shows that are doled out that way.
Well, also you have to think about the kind of reading that was going on, right? Like, again, we have a sense of this from things like Little Women, right? Do you read alone or do you read collectively, right? There's quite a lot of reading aloud, right? Especially of things that are serialized and short enough to be read aloud. So you can imagine conversations, or so you're reading the chapter, let's say, where Pip comes into contact with Herbert Pocket in London, and there's that recognition scene, and maybe a couple of you in the room are like, what? And then others like, no, remember when, blah, blah, blah. And it gives you a communal reading experience. I'm sure that has to have been part of it.
That's a really interesting idea, especially thinking about writing for an audience that's going to respond like that.
Yeah.
Like you want to include the details that a few obsessives are going to notice. You see that a lot now with TV shows that are designed so you have something that somebody on the internet can recognize. Oh, that's a reference to that other thing. And then you can have those kinds of conversations about it. I guess it's very similar.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like my daughter and my son watch Survivor, right? And so they watch it separately, like one's in Canada, one's, down here. And then they talk about it for like literally an hour and a half afterward because they have to dissect every detail of what they saw and, connect this to some plot strands in the reality show from earlier in the season, right? So this kind of, reading alone and together has got to be part of the experience.
Now, my sense is that Great Expectations is part of a middle period in Dickens' writing.
Yeah, late period. He dies in 1870, right? So he's a mature writer. He's kind of at the top of his skills, but it doesn't feel like a novel of like later life. I guess I say that because I'm so struck by, and I was struck again by, the way he captures childhood. I think Orwell talks about that too, right?
Oh, yes. And I completely agree that one of Dickens's strengths, or at least based on this book, is how well he captures childhood. And at a time when it seems like not many others were doing that. I mean, this is even before Little Women.
Yeah, like it's not sentimental or any of that stuff, right? Like the way children feel when they experience injustice, or when they're treated abusively, or when they're confused, or when they lie under pressure, right? Like all these things that, anybody who spent time around young children is familiar with, right? Or, if you remember your own experiences. And that's really striking.
Yeah, exactly. Pip responds with the psychology, a recognizable psychology of a 6 or 7 year old, however old he's supposed to be at the very beginning. And I guess in a certain way it continues on. I mean, throughout the bulk of the novel, he is either a teenager, what we would call a teenager, because I don't think that term existed yet, or he is a young man. And boy, does he act like a teenager and a young man in many ways.
Yeah, really concerned with how other people see him, right? Incredibly self-conscious.
Really confident in what he is doing without any real reason to be. I remember that feeling.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And, and his psychology is interesting all the way through because he's always beset by this kind of sense of shame, right? Like he's anxious what other people think of him. He's constantly sort of picking over his own emotional responses to things. And because the psychology of the child, Pip, is so well articulated in the opening chapters that it's hard not to think about like how much that childhood experience shapes the kind of person he becomes once the expectations appear on the horizon, right? So like it's an abusive environment. You mentioned he's brought up by his sister. And there's much made in the opening chapters of how she brought him up by hand, right? Which on the one hand means when a mother dies in childbirth, somebody has to give that child nourishment, to give that child milk by hand, right? With a spoon or a sponge or whatever you use to feed that child, right? But Mrs. Joe brings him up by hand in the sense that she beats the bejesus out of him on a regular basis, right? So there's much made of that sort of play. And it's treated in a really playful kind of way and a kind of joking kind of way. But like, that's really, that's bad, right?
It is bad. She often beats him with what
the tickler. It's a wax-ended piece of cane worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. Like it's funny, but only not.
Yeah, it's a weird way of minimizing it and naturalizing it, but also keeping that sense of the terror of it there.
Yeah, it's worn smooth, right? Like, so this happens all the time.
Yeah.
And what does that do to you? How does that shape you, right? Like, I know the 19th century, right? There's this expectation that corporal punishment is a normal thing for children, right? So that's true. But there's a clear sense that this is excessive. This is more than is the norm.
And she also is abusive to her husband, to Joe, which serves in terms of the novel to allow Joe and Pip to seek refuge in each other.
Yeah, they're almost like peers, which is a fascinating part of the novel and part of that really interesting emotional landscape of the first third, especially. Great friends, right, is what Joe always says about himself and Pip, talking about how close they are to one another. And at one point later on, once Pip has gone off to London, and Biddy, who's come to live in their household at that time, once Mrs. Joe becomes incapacitated, Biddy writes a letter to Pip to let him know how they are and ask how he's doing. And at Joe's request, she says, Joe has asked me to write, "What larks?" Right? And then a little later on, she said, I read it over to him and he said he wants me to write again, "What larks?" again, right? So like, it's something one kid would say to another, right? So this big, strong man, blacksmith man, right? Who's a stepfather to Pip and the child, they're almost like playmates on some level, right? And they're both abused by Pip's sister, Joe's wife.
One of my favorite details from this novel is a passage about that. I'll read a bit from it. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers, and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices of our food by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. That's such an amazing detail of tenderness between two people in a rough situation. It's so perfect for a way of interacting with a child. I could imagine myself, when my nephew was younger, that we might have played that game even though there was no abuse anywhere in our household. But like, it's just such a fun, childish game to play. And Joe is entirely open to it and up for it. And in a sense, yes, Joe is kind of like another child in the good ways, but he's also an incredibly responsible adult. So he's sort of untainted by adulthood.
That's a really neat way to put it.
And also there are several points in the novel where it's clear that even though Joe is the husband of the woman who is raising Pip, Joe doesn't quite consider himself to be Pip's father or even Pip's family.
Yeah. He'll say, best friends and things like that.
Yeah. Even in terms of like official people encountering Joe and saying, "What is your relationship with this boy?" He's like, "Well, he's a friend of the family. Like, I know him. We're good buds." There's no sense of that kind of filial ownership going on there.
Though he helps Pip out, like, in all different kinds of ways. Like, when Pip's a child, he sort of protects him from the tickler by sort of stashing him behind his leg in the corner of the chimney place, right? And then later on, when Pip is ill, Joe saves him from his debts and so on, and kind of gets him out of a bad situation. So he's a benefactor, I guess, as well as a friend.
Yeah, Joe is one of the heroes of the novel. Joe is absolutely one of the characters, in a sense, most to be emulated, most to be looked up to, given the most sympathetic reading. There is no flaw with Joe.
Yeah. And a strange thing happens late in the novel. Near the end, Pip returns back to his village, and he's come back to visit Joe and Biddy. And he looks in the kitchen and he says, there, smoking his pipe in the old place by the kitchen firelight, as hale and as strong as ever, though a little gray, sat Joe. And there, fenced into the corner with Joe's leg, and sitting on my own little stool looking at the fire, was I again. We give him the name of Pip for your sake, dear old chap, said Joe, delighted when I took another stool by the child's side, and we hope he might grow a little bit like you, and we think he do. And it's such a weird moment, right? Because it's the next to last chapter in the book, right? And it reminds us of that scene early on in the book when Pip is the little kid in the corner of the chimney. And Pip is like looking at himself, as it were. And he is looking at Pip because they've called the child Pip after him. So it's strange, like it's almost like time has stopped, or we're back where like Joe is in that same time, like he's never left that time in a way, right? But Pip is like separated from himself. I mean, I don't know if that's a sort of too complicated way of reading it, but it's such a strange moment.
It seems to offer Joe the Pip of his own that he always deserved.
Yeah.
Right? That's one of the satisfying ways of seeing it. And it's also offering Pip the version of himself, because by the end of the novel, he will regret the expectations that were foisted upon him. And he will wish that that had never happened and that he had always stayed apprenticed to Joe as he was when he was a child to become a blacksmith.
Yeah, that happy ending he imagined for himself in talking to Biddy on the riverbank, right?
Yes. I guess we should explain who Biddy is.
Yeah.
Biddy was one of Pip's school teachers, although she's not much older than him.
Well, no, like she was actually in the class, but the teacher was so incredibly non-functional that Biddy sort of de facto ended up kind of teaching everybody else. So she is Pip's peer, better than he is at reading and writing. And he actually learns to read and write from her kind of in an informal way outside of the class.
Yeah, Biddy is like what Pip should have been.
In some ways.
In some ways, right? She never gets tainted by the great expectations of future wealth and gentlemanliness.
But she would never be taken in by that. She's so insightful. She's a strange character because she's kind of abject in some ways. When we were first introduced to her, she's described as kind of being grubby and like dirty, and her shoes are really worn down. Like she's clearly living in poverty in a way that's different from Pip's experience. But she's bright. Like she's really insightful. She's better at reading and writing, but she also, like when Pip's like, oh yeah, we could have had this kind of future. And she's like, yeah, right. And then they're like later on, he'll say how he will always plan to come back and, be in touch and do this and that. And she's like, she's really kind about it, but she's basically like, yeah, sure you will.
Yeah.
Because she knows.
She's a better reader of character than Pip is.
Yeah.
And a better reader of Pip than Pip is.
Absolutely.
At that time anyways. I kind of also want to unpack this a little bit more about Joe and Biddy both being such good characters. There's a sense when I was reading it that they are both in this category of the deserving poor. Mm-hmm. Like they're both lower class, let's say. It's not actually clear whether they're poor or not. Joe is shown to never really be in material want. There's always food. He's never stressed about not being able to afford things, let's say. His nice Sunday clothes don't fit and look awkward on him. He has no idea what to do around gentlemanly people. It's all terribly awkward for him.
He's funny because he's in some ways, I was thinking about, is he a weak character or a strong character? He's a strong character, obviously, physically. He's a blacksmith, right? So there's physical strength, and that's something that we understand about him from the very beginning. But he's also a childlike character, as we said earlier, in his relation with Pip in a way that's really striking. Like he engages with Pip on that level in a way that's very charming. And he has a kind of emotional clarity that is childlike, like not in a bad way, right? Not childish, but childlike. And he speaks in a way that reflects his, like, I don't want to say poverty, but like that he belongs in a rural environment. When you see his speech written down, there'll be W's for V's and so on. So the word divisions shows up as divisions. But he, at the same time that he has these childlike qualities and these sort of rural qualities in his speech, he's also like wise. There's this one moment where he's talking to Pip and they're about to like go away from one another, leave one another's company. And he says this, life is made of ever so many partings welded together, as I may say, and one man's a blacksmith, and one's a whitesmith, and one's a goldsmith, and one's a coppersmith. Divisions among such must come, and must be met as they come. If there's been any fault at all today, it's mine. You and me is not two figures to be together in London, nor yet anywheres else but what is private, and beknown, and understood among friends. It ain't that I am proud, but that I want to be right. As you shall never see me no more in these clothes. I'm wrong in these clothes. Right? So it's on the one hand, it's low, right? Like his speech is low, but it's quite beautiful, I think. And also it's like deep, right? Life is made of many partings and they can't go together, right? There's classes, right? There's a blacksmith and a silversmith and a goldsmith, right? And they inhabit different rungs, so to speak, in the world of smithing. And that microcosm corresponds to the great wide world. And there's divisions there. And you and me, Pip, right, we're divided now. And it sounds pretty deep, right? So Joe is this really interesting character, I think.
It is, but it's also interesting that that's so much sort of accepting the status quo, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Joe is tradition bound and he understands the world is the way it's being presented to him and cannot imagine trying to make a dent in the social order. And in some ways, this seems to be part of his goodness, part of the thing that Dickens admires in both Joe and Biddy is that they know their place and they're sticking to it.
Well, part of that is rural life as opposed to city life, right? As Dickens gives it to us, right? The city is the place where things can change and things can be not what they seem. And things move at an enormously fast speed, right? I mean, part of that is the movement of capital, which he talks about quite a bit, right? It's the part of it is the economic driver of the city. But people are exchanged and changed also, right? In a way that doesn't happen in the village.
Well, I mean, of course, Dickens was a child of the city, right?
Mm.
And that's what he knows best. So this might be his imagining of what it's like in rural life.
Well, it's sort of complicated, right? Because he's born down in Portsmouth, but his father went to prison for debt. And he was sent to work in a blacking warehouse at the age of 12. So he had very little education. And then he became a writer, right? So he's a child of the city, but he's somebody who came to the city as a child in a sort of a kind of a traumatic kind of way, right? It's being set to work at a young age.
Oh, yeah. He hated the fact that he had to do that. And,
oh, yeah.
And apparently he didn't tell his wife about it until they'd been married for a good long time because it just embarrassed him so much and made him so upset to think about those days.
Yeah. Well, and that shame that we were talking about that Pip sort of carries on his back, right, is resonant with that in some ways.
So let's move over to talking about some of the instigations of some of that shame, because it all comes crashing for him when he meets people who are of a much higher class, which is to say when he gets hired by Miss Havisham and falls in love with Estella and wants to live up to what he thinks her expectations of him must be.
What do you think about Estella? How does she strike you? Does she strike you as someone's kind of loathsome, or do you feel bad for her? Or because she's a complicated character. Again, she's like Biddy. We don't get a whole lot about her. I mean, more about Estella than Biddy, but I think there's a kind of ambiguity in how we're allowed to see her.
It's a really interesting question. We are told that Miss Havisham has adopted Estella when she was quite young, and that she has single-mindedly raised her to destroy men, to be cold to men, to have them fall in love with her, and to ruin them in revenge against the man that wronged Miss Havisham. So she comes off as this created monster. And in fact, this aspect of the book reminded me quite a lot of Frankenstein.
I thought exactly the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if people talk about these two books together ever, but this idea of the monster who's created, that a human has some ownership over it. But by the end of the novel, Estella has turned against Miss Havisham as well. And she regrets that she meddled so much in someone else. And this idea of like, was that an understandable thing for Miss Havisham to have done? And was it a good thing for her to have done?
Yeah.
And recognizing those as being two different questions with two different answers, perhaps, is such an interesting thread. So Estella comes off as a character who is not much in control of her destiny. Right? She's sort of been made this way.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, you were thinking about Frankenstein when you were reading the account of Estella's relationship to Miss Havisham. And I was totally thinking the same thing. And then there's this one passage that just makes it so evident where Miss Havisham is all angry with Estella for being so cold.
Yes.
And Estella's like, you got to be kidding me. You made me. It's just like that moment, right? In Shelley's Frankenstein, where the monster is like, you made me this, right? It's like this. Miss Havisham says, you stock and stone, you cold, cold heart. What? Said Estella. Do you reproach me for being cold? I am what you have made me. I mean, the scene goes on. It's in this way, and it's really worth reading. It's really striking. But this quality of, the thing you've created, right? Don't complain if it turns back upon you. It's fascinating. But then also this whole question of love, like you never gave me love. How can you expect me to give you love? Right? There's this really interesting emotional dynamic there in the Havisham household.
I want to put a pin in this thought and come back to it in a second, because I think it relates interestingly to some of the other characters. For example, Miss Havisham herself. What created her? I feel like she's being set up as a kind of horror figure.
Oh, especially early on. Yeah.
Yeah, especially early on, especially when first encountered by a child who is completely overwhelmed by the strangeness of this situation. Not only is he not used to being around upper class people, but this is a particular shade of upper class that is unusual even amongst them.
The house is dark. Some of the windows are walled up. The others all have their shades down. So it's incredibly dark in the house in the middle of the day. So you have to have candles to see.
There's like insects running around everywhere.
Oh my God, the bride cake, right? The wedding cake.
The
Do you
cake is
remember
there
that?
after 10 years or so. It's still
Oh,
there.
wait. I have to give you a couple lines. The most prominent object in the room was a long table with a tablecloth spread on it, as if a feast had been in preparation when the house and the clocks all stopped together. A centerpiece of some kind was in the middle of this cloth. It was so heavily overhung with cobwebs that its form was quite undistinguishable, and as I looked along the yellow expanse out of which I remember it seeming to grow like a black fungus, I saw speckled-legged spiders with blotchy bodies running home to it and running out from it. I mean, God. And then there's mice, and I was like, it's like almost like a Edgar Allan Poe-like moment. It's so disgusting.
It is. And somewhere around there is also where she talks about, this is the table where I will be seen when I die. And these are where all the people will stand.
I mean, that's right? Like this horrible, rotten, fungus-like cake with the spiders running in and out of it. This is where they'll lay me. You're like, oh.
Exactly. Yeah. So she's kind of monstrous. She's described as the witch of the place, as looking like that. But is she the monster, the scary thing that's going to do you harm? Or is she the victim of the horror, right? As you eventually discover, like she's had this tragic backstory where she was set up to be the victim of a crime, of a fraud, basically. Her half-brother had a partner who wooed her and finagled a lot of money out of her and then left her at the altar. And she did not take it well. She was, deeply in love, it seems. And she was poisoned by the experience of being turned down unexpectedly at the last minute.
And time stops.
And time stops for her. And she stops all the clocks upon the death of her dreams and continues to live out that moment, right? She just obsesses over that moment. And everything she does from then on is in relationship to what has happened to her until much later in the novel. Until after that scene with Estella, and she starts to realize that some of her actions have had terrible consequences. And at a scene which is one of the most famous scenes in the novel, when she catches fire.
I know, it's just an amazing moment, isn't it?
It's a completely amazing moment to imagine this woman who is in this dress that she hasn't taken off for however long it's been at that point, 20 years or so. That's gone yellow, this yellowed wedding dress. All these like crumpled just grossness in the house, all this disarray. And finally it catches fire and she gets burned, and Pip is there, and Pip tries to save her and burns his hands at it. She doesn't die from it, which is how I remembered it happening. I was a little surprised to realize that she doesn't die. But there's a sense in which at that point in the novel, it's become clearer that she is a victim. She's been a victim of what has happened to her and a victim of the choices that she's made. They've come back to haunt her. Estella doesn't turn out to show her the love that she hoped that she would. And this idea of the burning of her, of changing her flesh as being this kind of final act of terror that's happened to her. I don't know. It struck me as really interesting.
Yeah, it's like this moment of incredibly vivid kind of immolation. He goes to check on her. He says, I looked into the room where I had left her, and I saw her seated in the ragged chair upon the hearth close to the fire with her back toward me. In the moment when I was withdrawing my head to go quietly away, I saw a great flaming light spring up. In the same moment, I saw her running at me, shrieking, with a whirl of fire blazing all about her, and soaring at least as many feet above her head as she was high. And he throws his coat on her, and it's like, almost like, I don't know, like an explosion or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's like a thing in that moment. It's extraordinary. And
it's happened right after Pip has visited her, asking her to do a favor that would be a kindness to Herbert, to her cousin, basically, from part of the family that she is not on good terms with. And she agrees to do it, and then she asks Pip for forgiveness for having created Estella and sicked her upon him, which Pip is happy to give. And so once she's had this arc of her story a bit resolved, it's finally resolved by this catching fire, by this terrible burns that she acquires and eventually dies from, though that takes a while.
The reason that strikes me so much is that you would kind of, if you think about her as a kind of a thing, as a monster, as a source of terror, it would make sense for her to kind of be immolated in that moment. And when she's laid out on the table with the white cotton wool pulled up on her, that to be her corpse, like the wedding cake and so on. But instead she persists, right? And that in a way makes her more human. In other words, she's not just a spectacle. She's also a human being under that. Right? And it comes back to what you were asking before about, is she a monster or is she someone we feel compassionate toward? Like the extended period of her life beyond that fire kind of reminds us of her as a human being and not just a thing.
And I think also that the act of giving some money back to the pockets, to her estranged family members. Because the other thing that we get from her side of the story is that she's surrounded by the sycophants, the family members who are desperate to get in her good graces because she's the rich person in the family. And so they're always pressuring her and they're always ingratiating themselves to her in ways that she cannot stand. She sees immediately through them. She can't stand them, but it has also poisoned her relations to everyone else because she's always assuming that people are first and foremost after her money. It takes her a good long time for her to accept that Pip and Joe are not seeking to drain her of every penny or seeking any money from her at all, really. There's a time when Pip assumes that his expectations are coming from her, but he never seeks more from it. And it's only after he's really clarified this by, again, time and time again, not asking for money, that he's finally able to ask for money for someone else from her. So there's a sense of kind of horror in what happens when you have money, how it turns people away from you, how it turns people against you, how it changes your relationships to other people. And this is something which happens to Pip as well, right? Like he gets his expectations and then suddenly his relationships with Joe are completely strained. Joe thinks he is a different person now, and in many ways he is, and cannot interact with him in the same easy way that he did when Pip was younger and had no expectations.
Yeah.
And so I think also there's this question about Estella. You know, is she created that way? There's a sense in which the novel is all about trying to create Pip into a particular kind of person and how that doesn't quite work out. That doesn't happen. But there is this threat. The Great Expectations are a huge threat to Pip, right? They kind of ruin him.
They do. They make him in debt, right? And all that comes with that.
They make him in debt. They cut him off from his support system, as we would say these days.
His family, right?
Yeah, his family and his friends. Mm-hmm. He gets these new friends who are not, for the most part, not very good friends. And
though he does have benefactors, like in a small way, like Herbert Pocket in his own way, and Wemmick, right? Both look after him in certain ways. But you're right, by and large, he's gone into a dangerous world as a result of those expectations.
Yeah, and he's been given very little guidance except the fact that he has expectations. Like he is nominally being trained into how to be a gentleman, both by his roommate, who has a bit more experience in how to live in the city and how to think about money.
Who teaches him table manners, if you remember in that one
in a really fantastic sequence, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But is also nominally being trained by Herbert's father, although nothing comes of that as far as I can tell. So he's gotten really very little guidance in what to do with this. Like, so he's lost any semblance of a parental structure by being given these expectations and taken away from his home, taken away from his apprenticeship with Joe. It's just dangerous to set him out like that. And he makes terrible decisions.
Yeah. And this parental structure is, that you just mentioned, is something that both for Estella and for Pip plays out in these really peculiar kinds of ways, these really unsatisfactory kinds of ways. For Estella, as we saw, Miss Havisham criticizes Estella for being so cold. And Estella's like, yeah, you've been a mother to me, but you didn't give me love. How can I give you this back? And Pip, his father died before he was born. Joe is more of a peer and friend than a father. And then when Magwitch turns up, he presents himself to Pip as a kind of second father. So the mother-daughter and father-son relationship shows up over and over again in this book, but in very weird kinds of ways, like very unsatisfactory and sometimes really scary kinds of ways.
We should talk a bit more about Magwitch, the convict.
Yeah. I remember the first time I read this book, and then Magwitch turns up to be the benefactor. Spoiler, right? And I was like, whoa, that was really exciting.
Yes, I remember not reading that and coming to class that day and finding out and being completely surprised, I guess.
Yeah, because it comes out of nowhere because you're so convinced that it's Miss Havisham is the benefactor. Like, Pip believes that, so you believe it with him. And then when it turns out to be the convict, it's like...
Yeah. So we get Magwitch. We also get Jaggers, who, in addition to being Miss Havisham's lawyer and taking care of that, most of his time is spent as a criminal lawyer, and perhaps the best criminal lawyer in London. Certainly all sorts of criminals they all know him. He's definitely famous within the criminal world, but he's also one that they look to hire to get them out of things.
And they fear him, right? Nobody will rob his house. He leaves his house famously unlocked because nobody would ever dare rob him.
Exactly. It's this interesting sense of power within criminal society. And we get a real tour of a lot of that. We get all sorts of chapters where we're just looking at the justice system or the prison system. They live near Newgate Prison, and we get to go inside it at some point and talk with some of the criminals there. And these sections reminded me so much of The Jungle, where you're going to the big city. There's this interesting, unfamiliar part of big city life that you've maybe heard about, but you've never really thought about it. And you're given a tour of it, but it's not quite as effective and not quite as pointed as Upton Sinclair was, because Pip never gets involved. He never goes to jail. He never goes on trial. He just sees people who are working on it. So it feels a bit tacked on, I guess. Not quite, but not as fully fleshed out as it would be in The Jungle.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, it's context, right? It's that local color, right? It's that vivid portrayal of actual real places in London of the 1830s that they're doing a certain kind of work in the background of the novel. There is a little bit different. For Upton Sinclair, the city and the meatpacking and all that is the subject of the novel, right? In a way that's a little bit different from Dickens, I think.
Yeah, this is not Oliver Twist. We're not dealing with a criminal class of characters primarily. And
Jaggers has a whole bunch of people working for him. My favorite one is Wemmick.
Wemmick is the other good character.
Oh my God, I love Wemmick.
Yeah, he's great. he's a clerk for Jaggers and
hard-boiled. Well,
right? But because he has to
apparently.
Because that's the persona he needs to have in order to be successful at this job. And it's one that he happily sheds when he goes home at night.
He keeps these two worlds totally separate.
Yes. At home, he's got an aged father. He lives in this kind of castle. He's constantly rigging up these elements.
At the back of the house, he's got like a garden and a pig and chickens and rabbits, and he grows cucumbers.
He's got a moat and a drawbridge, even though it's quite easy to, just step over the thin moat. But nevertheless, he's incredibly proud of it. And it's just this world of delight and invention and untrammeled creativity.
And that he's made for himself, right? He says, I'm my own engineer and my own carpenter and my own plumber and my own gardener and my own jack of all trades.
Exactly. And he needs to keep this world out of Jagger's hands, out of his boss's knowledge.
Yeah, he asks Pip, he said, just don't say anything about this. If you don't mind, don't say anything about this. He keeps these two worlds completely separate.
Exactly. Yeah. Pip will get advice from the London Wemmick or from the home Wemmick.
Exactly.
And they will be very different kinds of advice because one of them is in his official capacity and one of them is in his personal capacity.
He says the office is one thing and private life is another. When I go into the office, I leave the castle behind me. And when I come into the castle, I leave the office behind me.
And this is fantastic. And he's a delightful character. And it seems to me that this is one potential answer to Pip's problem.
That's it, right? Two worlds. You can have the two worlds, but you have to not let them touch.
I mean, I guess this is the question. Could Pip be a gentleman and then take some time off to not be a gentleman and spend time with Joe and have this more relaxed relations with people who, as a gentleman, it seems to be his job to not be near, to avoid contact with?
Well, this is the thing. Right? This is the thing, right? Like Wemmick can inhabit these two worlds, but could Pip do anything like that? Because this is a question of class, right? Like, can you be a gentleman and also be at home with Joe and Biddy? And the answer seems to be no. Like, they can still have these ties of affection. But when Pip comes back to the village, like all those years later, and he looks in the kitchen and he sees little Pip, he's estranged from that world. That's why it's such an uncanny moment, right? It's a world he can never inhabit again. He's been replaced in some sense.
That's certainly true. But I also don't entirely trust Pip here because he's not really trained in how to be a gentleman. He doesn't have anyone who has figured this out before him. So he understands that his role is to not associate with low things. And definitely some people seem to agree with that. But there's nobody who's saying, well, wait, maybe there is a way, right? Nobody has put that energy forward. And there's no one in the novel who's well positioned to have been able to think about that.
Yeah. Well, like Joe even says, right? There's blacksmiths and whitesmiths and goldsmiths and coppersmiths, right? And they're all divided, right? So it's not just that the upper classes don't associate with the lower classes. It's that everybody understands this is the system.
Yeah, exactly. So when Magwitch finally shows up on his doorstep, Pip is horrified.
All the work near and afar that tended to the end had been accomplished. And in an instant, the blow was struck and the roof of my stronghold dropped upon me. As if this calamitous, like it's like I don't know, like a guillotine or something, as if everything just sort of falls down upon him. And it's in that moment that Magwitch appears. So it appears as a catastrophe. I mean, it doesn't end up being that, but it is positioned as if it's a catastrophe and like a turning point.
Yeah, this has completely changed everything. First off, it's a catastrophe in the sense that it's not, the world is not as Pip understood it, right? He thought this money had come from this Havisham, and it turns out, no, it has not.
Well, it's dirty money.
Well,
this is the thing, right?
Sort of. Like, it's
Well,
interesting.
I mean, that's how he understands it, right? Because there's that great moment, right, when he's talking to Magwitch, and he refers back to a time when another prisoner who had been freed gave Pip as a child a shilling, but was wrapped in 2 pieces of paper that turned out to be 2-pound notes that were grubby and smelly and old, right? And his sister put them aside, to try to return them to the guy. And so Pip wants to kind of repay those 2 pounds. And so he takes out 2 clean notes. They're described as like clean banknotes from his wallet, and he gives them to Magwitch as if he's paying him back. And like, now they're quit, now they're even. And Magwitch twists them up and lights them on fire because he doesn't need money. I mean, he's really fabulously rich now, right? And this question of like, is the money clean or is the money dirty, right? Like, not just literally, but metaphorically, seems to be a lot of what's going on in Pip's head around that time.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that we would think of dirty money as money that had arisen from crime.
Yeah.
But this money,
because the money is clean in the sense that he's earned it fairly. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just coming from somebody who is low and was a criminal.
That's it.
And therefore, it would be terrible to be associated, to have it be known to be associated with that. Although Pip isn't thinking so much about other people, it seems. He's just actively disgusted by it. Uh-huh. He's at least at first, he's completely disgusted by Magwitch, and he's completely disgusted that his money is associated with this figure. That will not do.
Yeah, no, exactly. As long as he thinks the money is coming from his Havisham, he's cool with it. It's clean.
This is a good quandary to have Pip deal with because it doesn't make any sense outside of Pip's logic. Mm-hmm. Certainly from my perspective, this makes no sense at all. Like, this is completely incoherent, except that Pip has some anxieties about class. And yet, over the course of trying to get Magwitch safely out of the country, which they don't succeed in doing, he does come to appreciate Magwitch more.
Well, they develop a loving they develop a loving relationship. What I mean is Pip begins to reciprocate the loving relationship that Magwitch has toward him.
Well, yes. Although it's also interesting to say that as a loving thing because, of course, when Magwitch shows up, the way he describes Pip is as the gentleman that he owns.
Yeah, that's true.
And they don't go into that terribly much, but this idea that Magwitch has created Pip, sort of as we were talking about before, the way Miss Havisham created Estella, Magwitch has created Pip. And so he has this sense of owning this gentleman. And the reason he comes back to England is to see the gentleman that he's owned, to see this thing that he's created. It's not really out of a sense of love for Pip. It's not like he wants to get to know Pip. He just wants to see the gentleman that he's made.
Well, it's 2 things, right? I mean, it's partly that he wants to see the gentleman he's made, but he also explicitly couches that relationship in terms of the father-son relation. He says, Pip, dear boy, I've made a gentleman on you. It's me what has done it. I swore that time if I earned a guinea, that guinea should go to you. So he's that's that kind of ownership thing, right? He's made this boy into a gentleman, but he says this too. I'm your second father. You're my son, more to me nor any son. I've put away money only for you to spend. Right. So it's like that weird ownership kind of thing, but it's also filial, right? It's also understood as a father-son relation. And then when Magwitch has been captured and is in prison, is in the prison infirmary where he's going to die, Pip develops like an affective response to him that kind of answers that part of what Magwitch has for him, I think. What do you think?
I think that the thing that I took away from that is that Magwitch, of course, doesn't realize that Pip already has a second father in Joe. Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking about how it's interesting that Pip doesn't really have a first father, but he has these competing second fathers, none of which are fully a father, right? Joe doesn't claim to be a father, even though he's sort of filling that role. Magwitch claims to be a father, but has very much not been there and has only very indirectly tried to affect Pip's life. And the only sort of normative father-son relationships that we get, the only sort of blood father-son relationships that we see are with the very good characters, right? We get Wemmick
and Aged
with his
P.
aged P, his aged parent. And then we have Biddy and Joe having a child in the standard manner, living with both parents and being raised well.
Which we just see right at the end, yeah.
So yeah, it's a novel about parental neglect or terrible parenting choices by second parents.
But this is the thing, right? Like, it's so interesting you say this because you're right. The only healthy relationship of that sort that we really get to see in detail is Wemmick and the aged parent, right? But what we're seeing is filial piety. Like, it's not so much that the father is being a good father to Wemmick, though we have to assume that that's the case because that's how you get the reciprocity. But what we're seeing is the son's filial behavior toward the father. And it corresponds, I really think it corresponds in an interesting way to what Pip will be to Magwitch once Magwitch is, on his deathbed at the hospital, where he conscientiously goes, right, every day. Pip says, I came in and his eyes lighted up as I entered. Dear boy, he said as I sat down by his bed, I thought you was late, but I knowed you couldn't be that. It's just the time, said I waited for it at the gate. You always waits at the gate, don't you, dear boy? Yes, not to lose a moment of the time. Thank you, dear boy, thank you. God bless you. You never deserted me, dear boy. And that's what he calls him through this whole scene, dear boy. So it's not the language of father and son. It's like sideways, kind of, dear boy, right? So it's still generationally split, but it's not quite father-son. It's a little bit like the relationship with Joe in that sense, that there's a generational gap, but a dear relation, but it's not quite father-son. That's so interesting.
At the very end of the novel, many, many years have passed by. Pip, having lost his great expectations, goes off to Egypt to become a business person for a while, and that's all very vague. He comes back, he sees the young Pip, as we've described, and then at the very end, he goes to Miss Havisham's house, although the house is no longer there. It's finally been torn down, and construction is about to begin on something else, and he encounters Estella there, who he hasn't seen for quite a long time since she got married to that terrible, terrible person. And they have a little communication, and they have a very sort of sweet remembrance about their youth together.
They've both come back to that place, which was so important for each of them, right? Like, he's come back to see Miss Havisham's house one more time, and she's done that too, coincidentally at the same time.
Because she owns the property, and she's finally building a house to live in there.
Mm-hmm.
So she says, I little thought, said Estella, that I should take leave of you, Pip. In taking leave of this spot, I am very glad to do so. Glad to part again, Estella? To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has been ever mournful and painful. But you said to me, returned Estella very earnestly, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now. Now, when suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but, I hope, into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were, and tell me we are friends. We are friends, said I, as she rose from the bench. And will continue friends, apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place, and, as the morning mists had risen long ago, when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. It's a weird ending, and I wasn't quite sure if I was reading it correctly, so I tried to search for it.
It's ambiguous, right?
It's ambiguous. It certainly doesn't explicitly lay its cards out on the table. Does that I saw no shadow of another parting from her mean actually they're going to be together from now on? And so I searched it, and yes, that is how most people interpret that line, certainly. But also, that's not the original ending from when it was serialized.
Yeah, no, it survives. It was shorter, and it's pretty clear that they're never going to see each other again. Instead, right after the scene where he's together with Biddy and Joe, 2 years later, he hears about how she's having a very unhappy life. He's in London, walking along Piccadilly with little Pip, Joe and Biddy's son. And a servant came running after me to say, would I step back to a lady in a carriage who wanted to speak to me? And he goes back, and it's Estella. And she says, I'm greatly changed, I know, but I thought you would like to shake hands with Estella too, Pip. Lift up that pretty child and let me kiss it. She supposed the child, I think, to be my child. I was very glad afterwards to have had the interview, for in her face and in her voice and in her touch, she gave me the assurance that suffering had been stronger than Miss Havisham's teaching and had given her a heart to understand what my heart used to be. So that was the old end, where they're never going to see each other again, clearly, right? It's a passing in the street. And includes a misapprehension of who that child is. And what Pip knows now is like, yeah, she's miserable too.
So this gives us a marvelous opportunity because we now have several endings to choose from. And as readers reading with affection
in communities,
exactly, we get to argue about what ending is best and what ending is most appropriate.
It's like at the end of every story in the Decameron, right? Where everybody's like arguing about, taking one side or another.
Exactly. So what ending do you prefer?
Well, I mean, one part of me recognizes that, a happy ending requires that either that the two people get together at the end or that there's a promise of the possibility of it beyond the end of the novel, right? That said, like the logic of the story is that they should never see each other again. Like the original ending is much more satisfying in the sense that, it's darker, but like, that's how it is, right? These people have been broken by what they came through in some ways, right? And the happy ending is not a possibility, right? So, I mean, that's Dickens, right? Like he gives you this like dark sense of the world and how bad it can be and how abusive. And yet also there's always the promise of the serendipitous happy ending or the happy coincidence or the unexpected good thing, right? So that's how he can leave you like that in that kind of uncertain middle ground. How do you see the future at the end of that book?
So of the two endings, I think I prefer the more modern ending because the encounter goes into much more detail and you get a lot more and a lot richer conversation between those two characters. However, I do not think it makes any sense for them to leave in any kind of relationship. And I absolutely love Estella saying, and we'll continue as friends apart. Still asserting that this is not going to happen. I know you want this to be, but we've got boundaries. And just because I regret that I was so cruel to you in the past doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly have a romantic relationship.
But what he thinks, though, is something slightly different, right? I saw no shadow of another parting from her.
Yes. And that can't be like, they can't get together. That doesn't make any sense.
No, class-wise, right? I mean, she's building a house and he's like,
He's a successful businessman.
Yeah, he's changed. The world's changed. So maybe it is possible in that sense, right? That they could be together.
Maybe, but they shouldn't. Like, I like the ending where she says, no, this is still not happening. Like, where she gets a final say in that. And he should, accept it and leave on good terms. That's what I would like it to be. Not, oh, no. She's going to once again assert her will, and Pip is once again going to ignore it for his own heart's desire.
You can imagine, though, like one of the reasons that's such a great ending is that it leaves your readers satisfied and yet eager to talk more, eager to think more, what could happen. It's like, I don't know, like you said, Star Wars before, right? Like you think about what's going to happen in the next episode. What are we expecting to happen, right? There's that kind of anticipatory sense.
And I think it also benefits from having this alternate ending that once existed. Like, I like how that raises the question even more strongly about what should the ending be. There's a real value sometimes in having alternate versions of the text that we are sometimes too quick to tromp down in our desire for there being one true reading.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot more we could say. There's all sorts of really interesting side plots to this novel that are totally worth talking about. We never mentioned Orlick, but oh well, maybe we'll have another opportunity to.
No.
I'm glad that I didn't hate this novel. I'm glad to have reread it, and although it totally wore on me by the end, I did not care for the final third that much. There were some good moments, but the adventure plot stuff, just no, it was grinding on. I was just like, get to the end already.
Yeah.
So, oh well. But there's a lot of really great stuff in this novel, so I'm glad we read it.
Me too. I think it's really got a lot to offer. And I'm looking forward to our next novel in the cluster on class.
Yes, we'll be doing Vanity Fair next, which comes up in that Orwell essay a few times, and rereading that this morning really got me in the mood to finally tackle that novel.
And whose favorite novel was that?
And yes, that was also C.L.R. James's favorite novel growing up, and one that he drew a lot of inspiration of. So I'm also curious to check it out from that perspective as well.
I'm eager for that as well.
In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/29. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.